Hello and welcome to History of Philosophy, SOSC 702140. What I'd like to do in this first short video lecture is to introduce the course outline, breakdown, whatever you want to call it, and then go briefly into the academic requirements. All of it pretty straightforward. And I think the first thing I want to do is introduce myself. My name is Edward Matthews. I have an honors in film studies, film theory and production. I have an MA in social and political thought and a PhD in philosophy. I study and work through the School of Languages and Liberal Studies at A2058. Right now we're online and will be for this summer. Hopefully next September we should be back in business in the building at A2058. In the meantime, though, everything's online, and you can contact me at the email that's here, ematthews@fanshawonline.ca, and I will respond to whatever email you may send to me. And that's kind of the whole idea. We can also set up a one-on-one if you want to unpack the material a little bit more carefully. You have any questions about the assignments or the tests, any of this stuff we can do one-on-one, or you can just simply watch the video lectures and or the Zooms. Okay, so my background, as I mentioned, continental philosophy. All that is really is philosophy from Western Europe, as opposed to Islamic philosophy, Eastern philosophy, Indian philosophy. There are many different kinds. My expertise, my speciality is in continental philosophy, but I am under no illusions that this is the only one. There are many different ways of looking at the world. This particular one is called continental. I have also a background in social and political thought. You'll notice that as I work through the material, whether in the video lecture or in the Zoom meeting, I like to situate the thinkers that we are discussing. I like students to know that Plato was an aristocrat, that Plato was a slave owner. The reason why he hated the demos, which is a fact in his writing, is because he was an aristocrat. Right? He looked down on the working class, for example. And that has a lot to do with the way in which these people think. I think the social and political background of an individual thinker is, at least in my mind, very important and certainly worth knowing. I have a very strong interest and a background in social anthropology. I like to sort of, the image for me is a kind of culture vulture standing on the sidelines looking in and seeing what's going on. Very strong interest in psychoanalysis as well. Linguistics and semiotics. What that is basically the study of language. Language to me is of paramount importance in conveying information to others, in recognizing the reality that we are within. And really the only way we can do that is through language. But when we talk about semiotics, it's a study of language, the study of signs, for example, signs as a kind of language. Any kind of visual language, it can be musical language, auditory of one sort or another. Semiotics is the study of systems as if they were languages. So we won't deal 100% with this, but periodically I think it would be important to keep that in mind. And then finally, also a background and very strong interest in women's studies. Unfortunately, we have to wait until the middle of the 20th century to find our first woman philosopher, female philosopher, Simone de Beauvoir, which to me personally is tragic. The only world in which women could express themselves up until the middle of the 20th century was in writing. And even then, writers, often female writers, had to disguise themselves and use male names. So it's unfortunate that we don't really hear from fully one half of the population until about the 1940s and 50s. So keep that in mind, because that has a lot to do with the way in which we see the world. So there'll be a course description, course learning outcomes, the weekly content, and then the academic requirements. Okay, so the course description is fairly straightforward. This is something I put together as a kind of a very general overview of what we are trying to do. So, philosophy is a discipline in which humanity asks the deepest questions about itself and its relationship to the surrounding world. Now, whether you are searching for reality or a social or political institution, it is the surrounding world as we know it. So how do we ask questions about it, and how do we understand our relationship to it? More importantly, and then on a basic level, What can I know? And how do I know it? And how do I know that what I know is correct? All of these issues really are important because they have to do with epistemology, which is basically the study of knowledge and how we know the things that we know and how we know the things that we know to be true. So those questions are very important and inform literally everything we're going to look at. Now, you then approach philosophical questions. What is a good life? What is the nature of beauty? What is the nature of truth? Is it a capital T truth, such as Plato would have hoped? Or is it kind of a lowercase, in quotations, kind of contested, situated truth that we are now finding out is perhaps closer to the truth? Questions about existence. How do we understand existence? How do we measure it? How do we define it? What are the tools by which we can understand existence? So, in this course, we will look at the answers to these questions and many others proposed by, I'm being facetious here, the titans of the history of human thought. Don't for one second believe that these are the only individuals in the history of thought that had anything to say. As I mentioned at the beginning, there is Indian philosophy, Islamic philosophy, Eastern philosophy, African philosophy, philosophies around the world. And each one of those disciplines have a different way of viewing the world, have a different way of defining and contesting truth, or existence for that matter. So the titans of the history of human thought for this course, will be primarily Western European, but that does not mean that they are the only voices. They are simply one amongst many voices. So if you want to understand the roots of the modern ideas that we use to define the world and understand the world, then hopefully you have come to the right place, and this will be the course that I hope you enjoy, because we're going to be looking at a lot of different things, and that's what I'd like to kind of do right now. Before we go any further, let's take a look at the course learning outcomes, what we hope to be able to do. And the first thing is to understand that the questions humanity asked itself have developed historically. So what does that mean? That means that over time, through the development of consciousness, the history of philosophy, these questions that we ask ourselves, because we are humanity, these questions have developed not only over time, but are a reflection of the historical context in which they are asked. So, history in ancient Athens, obviously vastly different. In fact, there was only at that time a glimmer, just an awareness that history was even a thing. And Herodotus, one of the very first historians writing during the Peloponnesian War, really one of the first individuals to even understand that there is something called the development of history. Well, lo and behold, that applies to thought as well, not just human actions. So, history changes everything over time, and we need to always be mindful of the movement of history, but also movement in history. So during a set period of time, let's say the 20th century or the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages for that matter, that is a set chunk of time, whether it's a couple of decades, half a century, 300 or 400 or 500 years, whatever that time is, that history develops out of something and it becomes something else. So there is the movement of history, but there's also movement within history itself. So we can ask ourselves, what has been lost? What do we lose as we move through time? What has been gained? Which is perhaps the more important question, because as we become more and more cognizant of the movement of history, we would like to think that we gain more than we lose, right? What do we lose? Prejudices, superstitions, mythological thinking. That's what we lose. Not a bad thing. What have we gained? Critical faculties, the ability to reason, scientific discoveries. These are all conditions of history and conditions of humanity. So those are, again, the sort of things I want to always have in the background as we are going through and working through these different individuals. The second one, applying historical arguments about human existence in a given context. I've kind of given you that already in extrapolating and unfolding the first outcome. Number 3, trace how ancient Greek thought, for better or worse, remember it was a slave state, has influenced the history of modern Western thought. Next week, the first thing we're going to look at is just basically the ancient Athenians. Right? We typically call them the ancient Greeks, but all of Greece, which was not even a country at the time that Plato and Aristotle and Heraclitus and all these really important figures lived, they were basically city-states. So Greek thought is really, in terms of philosophy, Athenian thought, right? The ideas of Athens. So the Athenian polis, or the Athenian city-state, is really the center of Western thought, modern Western thought. So that is the third sort of learning outcome. Number 4, evaluate arguments for or against social, political, or philosophical systems. We will certainly look at all these different systems, lots of isms to look at, whether it is materialism, idealism, existentialism, all of those isms, for better or worse, have their good and bad points. And we need to consider them, right? We need to think about them. 5, reflect thoughtfully and critically about existence in the modern world. And this is something that certainly starts with the ancient Athenians. In fact, it starts more so after Aristotle and the end of the city-state, right? The decline of the polis. And the reason why it happens then is because at that time, individuals who were associated and affiliated with a particular city-state, whether it was Crete or Sparta or Athens or elsewhere, those citizens had a very deep and abiding bond with the city-state to which they felt most associated. So imagine in the case of Athens, again, right, this is the cradle of Western civilization. It eventually falls apart. And there's a kind of moment of existential doubt with the post-Aristotelian thinkers. What do we do now? How do we identify who we are? What is good and bad behavior? What is morality? How do I know that what I'm doing is correct? So when we're thinking and talking about existence in the modern world, that modern world really extends almost 2,500 years, because questions and thoughts about existence start around the year 300 or so BC. And eventually it kind of fades out. Isms of one sort or another take over. And then we have the Dark Ages, the Medieval Ages, the all-powerful church in Western Europe. And it takes until almost the middle of the 1800s for philosophers to repose that same question, right? Existence. How do we know that we are living a full and authentic life? How do we measure that? How do we understand it and identify it and define it? So by the time we are looking at sort of the mid-1800s, we're talking about Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche. There's even a little bit of Marx and at that particular time. Questions about existence become more and more important because existence in the modern world, in the sort of industrialized, capitalized world, changes dramatically. And it actually becomes an ism in the middle of the 20th century, as in existentialism, which we're going to look at. That'll be our second last module. And then finally, 6, adopt a position in an intellectual debate and defend that position with careful and critical reasoning. This is something that I hope we can do with every single module that we go through, because it is important to understand how thinkers come into being, how their thoughts gain validity and kind of traction, and then why they kind of fade away. All right? There's a reason why that happens. So as we are engaged in an intellectual debate, what we need to make sure that we do is that we debate in an authentic and honest way. We cannot apply hindsight to something Plato or Marx or Hobbes or Locke or any of these other thinkers may have stated at a particular point in time, because this goes back to the first outcome, understanding the questions humanity asked about itself, developing historically. We can't turn around and fault someone from a 21st century perspective because they weren't in the 21st century. It's that simple. So we need to look at what else was going on at that time for them to make a particular statement like they did. So in an intellectual debate, when we are defending a position, we need to be able to defend it with that thinker's own words. Now, we can evaluate those words after the fact. We can interpret those words, but when we interpret, remember, we're implying that there are other interpretations, because that's what an interpretation is, one viewpoint amongst many. But when it comes to an evaluation, that's when we can maybe take that more modern approach. But in an intellectual debate, it's unethical to claim from the position of the 21st century that a certain person is wrong. Well, clearly, in hindsight and historically speaking, they probably were. But were they saying the right thing at the time, right? That's what we want to sort of think about as we work through all of this material. Okay, so Module 1 is what you're watching right now, and then there'll be the short question, what is philosophy? And we're going to unpack that. And immediately we jump next week into Module 2. And the question is, who, right? Why were the Athenians so important? Who were they? So, what is philosophy is another topic we want to look at. This will be the next video for this week. But we want to ask ourselves, what was it about the Athenians that we need to still consider today? I mean, it happened over 2,000 years ago. And we know there are other philosophies. Let's pose that question to ourselves and see if we can figure out why that is. Why is it that studying Plato and Aristotle is still important? It's still relevant and valid. So why were the Athenians so important? We'll see. And that's what we're going to start with as early as next week. Now, what I'd like to do each week is have a kind of discussion topic. And this doesn't mean having to discuss in a discussion thread, but it will be sort of a topic we're going to address in the Zoom meeting. Because I'm hoping that by the time you go through the module, you'll have a chance to take a look at the readings. Now, not all the readings need to be gone through. They're there mostly for further information and further research. But reading the PowerPoint slides, reading through them, and then watching the video lecture together should give you enough information to then be able to participate in the discussion during the Zoom meeting. Now, before going any further, unfortunately, this course does not have a set hour, so it's going to really, it's going to make it difficult for people to participate in the discussion that is going to be happening live. So we have to figure this out, and right now I'm making these at the beginning of April. I'm hoping that we will have a schedule, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult for individuals to participate in something they're watching essentially after the fact. But the discussion topic, whether you participate in it live or watch it later on, each week there will be a kind of topic, right? In this case, for Module 2, what is philosophy, which we're going to be looking at shortly. Okay, so Module 3, we're still staying with the ancient Athenians, and we move now to the first body of work that is recognized as philosophy in the Western tradition. And this is PreSocratic Thought, right? In the beginnings of natural philosophy, these individuals are working without microscopes, telescopes, and scientific devices to help them to understand the world. Well, really what they're doing is just trying to understand the world around them. And what is remarkable is how each one of these individuals, Parmenides, Zeno, Heraclitus, Thales, Anaximenes, and Anaximander, all these different pre-Socratic philosophers have fascinating ideas to present to us that, for the most part, we can still understand why they were thinking the way they were. And of course, one of the first thing that they do is move beyond reality, move beyond the visual or the material world to try to figure out what's going on behind it. So it is absolutely remarkable that the first thing we do is try to transcend the world that we live in, to try to understand what's going on behind, whether they are laws of nature, whether they are natural laws, whatever you want to call them, what informs the world that we live in. And that's essentially what is happening. And why this is important is because these pre-Socratic thinkers, who are natural philosophers or natural scientists, we'll say, of course, very early scientists, many of the discoveries that they present to their listeners, really then begins to seep into everyday life. And notions about the natural world being balanced in some way begins to inform their ideas about morality and ethics, and their ideas about political structures and political institutions. So it's quite remarkable that as they are looking around the world, or looking at the world that is around them, they are already able to see patterns and consistencies and predictabilities that they then import into other institutions, such as ethics, morality, politics, and so on. So we'll take a look at that in Module 3. As you can see here, the Presocratics, and there's quite a few of them, and an arche is a single principle, right? This is kind of a foundational principle. And as you can see, as different as each one of them are, what ties them all together is this arche, right? And what is the one thing that ties the world together? Where Thales thinks it's water. Anaximander thinks it is the boundless, or what in Greek would be the eperon. The eperon is this boundless source of life. Anaximenes believes it's air. Pythagoras thinks it's numbers. Heraclitus thinks it is change. So imagine the foundational law of reality is constant change. And the metaphor he uses is fire. Now, typically fire, we think it consumes things and destroys them. But Heraclitus is looking at fire as movement, right? Change and movement of one state into another constantly. So we have Heraclitus talking about change as his foundational principle of reality. And along comes Parmenides, living at the same time. He says, nope, it's the opposite. It's being, right? Being, the singularity of being. Empedocles, now we start kind of looking at things as they begin to make more sense. Empedocles talks about earth, air, fire, and water, these four elements that come together to create the world, to create reality. And obviously, earth and water have some degree of solidity. Air and fire, much more sort of vaporous. And it's the way in which they all combine together to create a world that comes into being and then dies away. Anaxagoras talks about seeds and germs as his foundational principle. And in Democritus, and then later Epicurus, who comes along after Aristotle, Democritus thinks it's atoms and the void. So each one of them, each one of these philosophers, as different as they were, and this is all within about 150 years. And we'll look at the reasons why they existed at the time they did, because they all essentially came from the Melanesian area, which is on the other side of the Greek Sea. Each one of them had this singular arche, right? This foundational principle that they believed that reality as we knew it was based upon. As you can see, water, air, numbers, change, being, the atoms, right? Quite remarkable. And again, without a single scientific device to figure that out. Now we get to Module 4, and we finally get to Plato. If you've ever taken the most basic philosophy course, everyone has to deal with Plato, unfortunately. But it is Module 4 where we actually start, and we begin in earnest to start accumulating this information. And we start with Plato and his notion of idealism as a political philosophy. And it becomes an interesting question by the 21st century, because our discussion topic here is metaphysics still possible in the 21st century, which is today? Idealism and metaphysics, certainly under a fair amount of attack, and really was at the turn of not the 20th century, but at the end of the 19th century. As we moved into the 1900s, from the 1800s, Nietzsche in particular, an individual that really went out of his way to basically break apart metaphysical thinking, and decided instead to focus on the here and now, right? The nowness of the world. And of course, he was also a kind of proto-existentialist, so less concerned with metaphysics. So the question becomes, is metaphysics still even possible in the 21st century? So that will be our discussion topic. And I know right now you might be shaking your head going, oh man, not sure if I can do very well. Don't worry. The whole idea is to think about the content of each of these video lectures or the content of the PowerPoint slides. And of course, we're not going to do a deep dive into metaphysics, but what I'd like you to do is to at least consider some different approaches to looking at Plato's thinking and Platonic thought, specifically idealism, because the way he uses it in political philosophy is quite unusual. Idealism also has to do with his notion of beauty and truth and justice. Again, these are all, capitalized nouns, capital B, beauty, capital J, justice. Like somehow this is it. This is the top of the heap. And over time, historically speaking, these ideas become tested and contested till finally we end up with a really shaky vision of what metaphysics is. So the question becomes, is it still possible in the 21st century? Now, the following week, by module 5, we're going to be talking about, we start with Plato the week prior, and then the following week we look at materialism and the real world, which is Aristotelian political philosophy. Aristotle is really the first person to start thinking in any serious way about morality and ethics as well, and presents to us in the Nicomachean Ethics a really consistent view of looking at what is virtue, right? What makes a virtuous person? And lo and behold, Aristotelian thought, and especially as it relates to morality, is still extremely relevant. In fact, I still use Aristotle's book on rhetoric in my critical thinking class. There's something remarkable about Aristotle and the way in which he thought in a very common sense sort of way. He was a biologist and a physicist by nature, but he was very much a thinker. So he applied his ideas to the real world, but did it in a way that is still relevant today. Or if it is not absolutely relevant, we can understand what it is about his thinking that really has validity. And again, morality and ethics, very important. Rhetoric is another one. His notion of human beings, social individuals, social institutions, and communities, also very relevant. So the discussion topic for this week, or for module 5, will be Aristotelian's thought. Should be Aristotelian thought, sorry, my mistake, through the ages, because there have been many, many revisits to Aristotle for all the reasons that I've just defined. Now we get to module 6, and we jump ahead, well, about 1,200 years, more or less, and we move to the Church, Science, and European Enlightenment. What I do in this course is I try to keep it very focused on a particular worldview, and that is the worldview of science, politics, society, and the institutions that we still recognize today. When I do philosophy, I like to keep it in the here and now. I like to keep it grounded in reality, because you can move, for example, in the philosophy of science or philosophy of other things, and get into nitpicking that seems to almost be, borders on irrelevant. And irrelevant in the sense that it is really difficult to find a practical application for it. They're thought experiments. I'm not a huge fan of thought experiments. They can be fun, but I find them to be ultimately kind of frustrating, because it becomes difficult to apply them to something. So my history of philosophy is very much grounded in the social, political, economic, cultural institutions that we still recognize today, which is why we make this incredible leap from Aristotle up to the church of basically the 1600s. So we move, 1,800 years in one fell swoop, but it does make sense. So the church, science, European Enlightenment, René Descartes, Francis Bacon, as they discuss what becomes known as the scientific method. And the discussion topic for Module 6 will be rationality in the scientific method. What is it? How does it work? What are its good and bad points? And we'll look at it and kind of unpack it to see if it actually is still relevant. Then to Module 7, we will get to the social contract theories of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And here we are doing the same thing. We're looking at institutions that we should still recognize, although the social contract has been sorely tested over the last couple of years because of the pandemic. And really it stems from two groups that are on either side of the issue. One looking at the pandemic as a health crisis, and the other group, Freedom Convoys and the rest, looking at it as some sort of political movement of some sort to encroach on our freedoms. Well, only one group seems to be looking at the pandemic as what it really is, which is a health crisis, not a political crisis. Anyway, so the discussion topic here will be the social contract still exists today. So we can talk about the pandemic, we can talk about various responses to it, but they all deal with social contract theories that stem all the way back to the late 1600s from Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and then writing in the 1700s, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And essentially, just to look at it here, the purpose of government, the two main ideas or the two main positions are the ones we see here. Thomas Hobbes believes that to impose law and order to prevent a state of war. Hobbes lived through the English Civil War in the 1600s. Now, he was smart. He took off to France to stay safe, but came back to his country, to England, and decided once and for all he would never let this happen again. He would never let a civil war almost destroy England. So he thought, okay, we need to be able to impose law, right? We need an absolute monarch, not a provisional or part-time or, a representative monarchy, an absolute monarchy. And okay, why would he say that? Well, because he lived through a war. And I've never lived through a war, and I hope none of you have. But I could imagine what it must do to a person when they experience war. What they would like more than anything else is law and order. Because the behavior that they're experiencing is not only chaotic and irrational, but also deadly. So, Locke and Hobbes have very different views of the role of government. Hobbes being much more strident and absolute, and Locke, writing roughly 25 years later, says, okay, why do we need government? Well, because we have natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are the natural rights that we are born with in this state of nature that we wish to have protected by law. So for Hobbes, the state of nature is a horrible place full of killing and just general nastiness. So we need to impose a law to prevent this. Locke says, look, we're reasonable creatures. We enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let's protect that. Let's legitimize it and make sure that laws protect the fact that we have them in the first place. Not only that, but he also was a big believer in representative democracy, which is a form of democracy where people, citizens, right, subjects, citizens can vote in governments and vote them out as well. And the real main difference between these two thinkers, Hobbes says, no, the monarchy can't get voted out. We need that kind of stability. Why? Again, he lived through a war. Locke, on the other hand, says, no, if the government that is there is not representing the people effectively, we reserve the right to throw them out. And that's kind of the long and the short of it. Okay, so now we're moving through, we're in the 1600s, the 1700s. Now we get into the tail end of the 1700s in Module 8, and we're looking at industrialization and the Scottish Enlightenment. The Scottish Enlightenment would be Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson. And the discussion topic is industrialization, right, and revolution after Adam Smith. What does that look like? Is it still possible? One of the main differences between Adam Smith and thinkers that come along about 100 years later is Adam Smith looked at capitalism and industrialization as being based on needs. And the idea is that individuals would be moral, all right, would actually be much more moral in terms of their thinking. And the end result is that we have a system where it has its own checks and balances. Now, within 100 years, it's out of control. Well, certainly it's out of control for citizens, but it does constantly seek a profit. right? It needs to continually seek a profit. Otherwise, it just dies. So the kind of capitalism and industrialization that Adam Smith is talking about is a very different one that comes along even as early as 100 years later. So that's what I want to look at, the Industrial Revolution after Adam Smith. What did it look like? Now, in the early 1800s, in Module 9, we look at a very important and significant philosopher, G.W.F. Hegel, and modernity. And here we start recognizing ourselves. We start to consider the modern world, modernity, and throughout the early 1800s, as capitalism is restructuring the institutions that we had been living under at the time, social, political, cultural, and otherwise, Hegel is writing it during that transitional phase. So again, historically, he's very much aware of where he is, and in fact, he really stresses that philosophy is written by people who are children of their time, right? They're individuals who only know so much and are aware that history will change, but at the same time, we need to be able to objectively observe the world around us. We can't put our own personality into it because there will be biases and prejudices of one sort or another. We need to look at the world in an objective manner. And this is exactly what Hegel does. Now, he writes about art, he writes about literature, he writes about nature, he writes about politics, he writes about recognition of the other, everything. He literally covers everything. So the discussion topic for this week will be what is living and what is dead in the philosophy of Hegel. Odd title or odd topic. Happens to be the name of a book written back in about 1908, 1910 by Croce, and he poses exactly the same question. So there are things in Hegel that are no longer relevant, but also many things that are. Now we're moving into the 1800s. Things are really starting to shake up, and that transitional period that Hegel had been living in is now sort of a full-blown revolution across Western Europe. So the Age of Revolution involves the tail end of Hegel. After his death in 1831, we end up with left and right Hegelians. We're going to look at a couple of left Hegelians because the right ones really don't do a whole lot. They don't really advance anything. But the left Hegelian or Hegelians, Ludwig Feuerbach and Karl Marx, really try to take Hegel much further, try to find that revolutionary impulse in his work, which was there in the early days. But because Hegel is writing at a time when history is transforming so quickly, he started as somewhat of a revolutionary romantic, figure. But by the end of his life in the early 1830s, the world has gone by him so fast that he almost sounds reactionary and outdated. So Feuerbach and Marx tried to go back and salvage, right, and rediscover that revolutionary impulse that was in Hegel's early work. So the discussion topic for that week will be Marxism and revolution in the 21st century. Does it even exist, right? Did it ever exist? What does revolution even look like, or revolutionary thought even look like in the 21st century? Module 11, we take a slight detour from politics, and we start now moving towards our existentialist ideas. And the age of doubt, religious doubt and doubt of selfhood, Arthur Schopenhauer and Søren Kierkegaard are two important figures, Kierkegaard being Danish, Schopenhauer being German. These are individuals that set the foundation for early existentialist thought. And each of them really speak to us in a very direct kind of way. There's something that is very contemporary and very modern about their thinking, their descriptions of the world around them. It makes sense to us. We recognize that world, right? Because portions of it are still there. Then we move to Nietzsche, who also is an early existentialist. And here we move from that age of doubt to basically sort of taking the bull by the horns. And for Nietzsche, it means devaluing tradition and, in a sense, hitting the reset button. And that also includes doing away with metaphysics. And when we are going to talk about Nietzsche for Module 12, we'll be talking about the end of metaphysics. So that again starts to make sense. But with Nietzsche, we have the end of all values. And what Nietzsche is trying to present to us is the possibility of being, well, as I said in Seinfeld, the master of your own domain. And that happens to be what Nietzsche is talking about. But these are masters without slaves, right? These are masters, individuals that can take control of their lives and achieve that which they are trying to achieve, that they're able to find the wherewithal to achieve the best versions of themselves. And again, the key here is this notion of masters without slaves. If you can be in charge of your life, because again, if you're Nietzschean, you have no one to blame but yourself. If you screw up, it's your fault. If you succeed, it's something you can celebrate because no one else did it except you. So again, we can recognize some ideas in Nietzsche that are very relevant and contemporary and modern because it is the way in which many of us see the world. But there's a touch of narcissism in there too as well. And we can talk about that as we talk about Nietzsche and the end of metaphysics. The last two modules here, the weekly content, module 13 is French existentialism, Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. These are the two most important figures in existentialist thought. Albert Camus also is another one, but he was a writer, not a philosopher. But Sartre and Beauvoir are the two individuals who really create what becomes known as existentialism, a philosophy about existence. The idea that our essence, right, who we are, is defined by our experiences. So again, right, metaphysics is kind of in the back seat, if even there at all, right? So experience precedes essence. So our experience, our day-to-day lives, define who we are, and the way in which we act defines our essence. And so existentialism looks at that in a very deep and abiding way. That's what I want to take a look at. And then finally, the last module here, module 14, this is sort of where philosophy kind of hits an impasse. And we're going to look at the Situationist International as they basically try to say goodbye to the 20th century. They're writing in the late 50s and throughout the 60s, right, the 1960s. So it might be in the lifetimes of your parents, certainly in mine. And I want to take a look at them because not only did I finish writing a book on them about a year ago, and I'm working on a new one on the same people, I think they have a lot to say, right? They have a lot to say that will help us to tie together many of the themes that we look at all the way through this course. And so the discussion topic for here will be what's called the 68th thought. The thoughts of May 1968 in France, where for almost 2 months, the country literally came to a standstill. There were so many people protesting, whether it was living conditions, wages, economic opportunities, student life, everything that people wanted to bitch about was over at this point, and it was time to turn the page, right? Time to say goodbye to the 20th century. So that will be the last module. And I just wanted everyone to see kind of the overview. So if you would like to come back for the second video, I'm going to be looking at a very simple question. What is philosophy? And that's really it. Now, I did mention we're going to take a look at academic requirements. I'm going to save that for the Zoom meeting for the first week. I almost said this week, but for the first week, because I want to show you where things are, and I want to show you due dates and sort of essay topics and so on. I figured it would make a little bit more sense to do it that way. So in the meantime, I will say goodbye, and I'll see you back in just a moment.